body or spirit for our opening hymn, number 126 in the gray hymnal, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. We are now going to enter a time of meditation, followed by silence, followed by the seated singing of Spirit of Life. I invite you to get comfortable in your seat, to relax your muscles, to ground yourself in this time and place. Our meditation today is by Bernadette R. Burns. For the joyful, may jubilant songs echo in our hearts, well beyond fading memories. For the sorrowful, may gentle songs of solace bring lasting healing to our hearts and minds. For the angry, may we join our voices together in songs of protest and hope. For all of us here in our community and our world, may we sing to the morning and evening stars as they guide our journeys.
Good morning. My name is Gul. I am honored to serve as your worship associate today. During our first visit to my homeland as a married couple, when my husband, Anders, met my family in Pakistan for the very first time, my brother shared with us a story from my father's life. In his deep voice, one that occasionally choked with tears as the summer evening gave way to dusk, my brother narrated an event that forever changed his general approach to life and specific views on grace and gratitude. This story, which I had never heard until that day, 20 years after my father's death, is what I want to share with you today. The story transpired at the neighborhood mosque when my brother was a teenager, just 16 or 17 years old. It was on a Friday afternoon as people were arriving for Friday congregational prayers. They would stand shoulder to shoulder in rows with prayer rugs before them. When a row is complete, the next one is formed, and so forth. On this specific Friday, my father and brother had arrived early and hence were able to stand in the first row, right behind the imam, usually a learned scholar who leads prayer in a mosque. Soon after, a bricklayer came, his clothing still stained red with the dust of the brick. He exchanged salutations with my father and brother and stood next to them in that first row. And then several rows behind them filled up. A few minutes later, a prosperous man, extravagantly dressed, shoved his way from behind, all the way to the first row. He moved up and down and between the rows, disappointed to find no place to stand in the first row. This man then suddenly squeezed his way in, standing awkwardly sideways between my father and bricklayer. The prosperous man asked the bricklayer to move out of the first row to one in the rear of the room. The bricklayer turned to leave his spot, looking meek and defeated. The rich man was overjoyed and was getting ready to move to the bricklayer's spot when my father put his hand on the shoulder of the bricklayer. "You should stay right here, sir," my father said. Then he turned towards the rich man and said, "God's grace is granted to us the same, no matter which spot or row we stand or sit in. You arrived later. Please consider taking a later spot, or you can take my spot." The rich man got visibly upset and spoke loudly in the quiet mosque, stating that my father had no idea how powerful he was and that he contributed large sums of money to the mosque every month. Therefore, in his mind, the first row prayer spot closest to the imam, the spot occupied by the bricklayer on this Friday, was his right. The rich man had influence, and the time for the prayer was approaching. My father patiently heard his ranting comments and then spoke softly, saying, "Please, let's be like-minded. Be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Let us look at those who are lower than us and not look at those who are higher than us. Let's be grateful unless we want to belittle the favors Allah conferred upon us." Then my father turned around to face the imam, and so did the bricklayer, my brother, and the rest of the congregation. Imam gave the declaration of Allahu Akbar, meaning God is greatest, a general declaration of faith or thanksgiving for prayer, and everyone offered the Friday afternoon prayer. Although very few in the crowd that day knew that my father had quoted Peter the Apostle and Muhammad, the last prophet of Muslims, the climate of the mosque after that incident changed drastically. Humility, gratitude, and inclusion often became the topics of the imam's sermons. And two separate community welfare programs, one for orphans and the other for single mothers, were funded and started by the mosque, and my brother participated in both of those. My father was offered a position to become the conflict resolver at the mosque. He declined, not wanting that official role. But he continued to remind people of the grace they have been granted and the grace that we are called to grant to others. And for those gifts from my father, my brother, my siblings, and I are forever grateful. Thank you for listening.
All I have and all I feel is all because of you. All I reap is all I sow, and love is our living proof. Thank you for life. Thank you for everything. I stand here in grace and gratitude, and I thank you. Seasons come and seasons go, no matter what we choose. 1,000 names, 1,000 roads, all lead to one simple truth. Thank you for life. Thank you for everything. I stand here in grace and gratitude, and I thank you. Thank you for everything. I stand here in grace and gratitude, and I thank you. I thank you.
As some of you know, I grew up Catholic here in the Milwaukee area. I didn't go to parochial schools, but both of my parents and their large extended families were Catholic. And a lot of my high school friends were in our high school youth group at church. My family did have some nice Lutheran neighbors, but our conversations with them were more about things like lawn care than biblical interpretation. Theological reflection was part of my life, but it took place almost entirely inside a Catholic bubble. It was a pretty big bubble, and it contained a version of diversity. My family went to a liberal parish, while many of my relatives most certainly did not. But any bubble recirculates the same air, and it was all variations on the theme of being Catholic. So for me, seminary was a crash course in Protestantism. Understanding Protestantism was a prerequisite for understanding Unitarianism and Universalism. And it was also a prerequisite for understanding Protestant culture, which heavily influences how UU churches do everything, from planning worship to conducting business. So for me, Protestant theology was an exciting new foreign country. I liked a lot of what I learned about Protestant thought and practice. There was the questioning of and the realignment of religious authority. That was a favorite. And as we heard last week, Martin Luther was a minister who had a wife nearly 500 years ago, while Catholicism today still doesn't allow married clergy. Protestantism seemed to represent big steps in the right direction. Still, I struggled with an enduring Protestant take on the key concept that is our theme this month here at First Church, and that concept is grace. Around the time of the Reformation, which was the big break from the Catholic Church that occurred 5 centuries ago, these early reformers of Christianity saw grace as the path to salvation, to an eternal afterlife in heaven. It was the only path, and God was firmly in charge of who was allowed on that path. Now, the path to salvation that I was taught was more like, follow the rules, don't sin too much, and you go to heaven. For all its limitations and flaws, this was a pretty straightforward system of choices and rewards that anyone could opt into. By contrast, early Protestant reformers believed that we ordinary folks got to heaven by grace alone. What did this mean? Well, it meant that our actions in this life were not what determined our destination in the afterlife. Rather, it meant that our fate was determined by God's unmerited favor. The thinking was that because all of humanity was a cesspool of sinners, no one deserved salvation. But some people still were going to be saved as a gift from God. Precisely who was going to be saved was not always clear and a topic of much debate. But whoever was promoting this take on grace always seemed to include themselves among the saved. Meanwhile, good works were simply to be performed as a demonstration of faith and obedience and not as a ticket to heaven. I am not a fan of this version of grace, this version of a deity, because of what it might mean for the spiritual lives of those who believe in it. It's one thing to honor a God who is beyond knowing, a great mystery. Given how finite we humans are and how infinite God might be, God might indeed be beyond our understanding. But a God whose behavior is unpredictable, a capricious God handing out grace seemingly at random, seems like a recipe for anxiety, division, and fear. Having grown up with a God of clear rules and a God who was a stern but loving ally, to me this more fickle God has seemed like a tool for keeping people afraid. As with many aspects of religion, a God who is stingy with grace offers one way to explain the workings of the world we live in. Why did one person survive the accident and the other didn't? Why did the wildfire wipe out one house and spare the one next door? Why was one man wealthy and the other man a poor bricklayer? Old school grace can be plugged in as the answer for all those questions. especially for those who assign God a lot of power in daily matters. In this life, bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. And so a capricious God may seem appropriate in a world that seems equally capricious. Humans have always been hungry for stories that make sense of all that is happening around them and to them. And yet, this particular version of grace has never made sense to me. It oversimplifies the world. Grace as an explanation does not give enough weight to human choices or to the realities of science. Maybe one house survived the wildfire because physics just happened to blow the winds a certain way. Maybe it survived because its owners cleared the brush around it or installed a metal roof. Maybe that bricklayer is poor because of human systems that keep wealth in a small number of hands and limit opportunities for others. God's grace can seem like a sideways answer, or even an abdication of human responsibility. So it was that kind of grace, that narrow strain, that divine favoritism that made me wary of the whole concept of grace. And I was not alone in this wariness. The entire universalist side of our religious heritage is founded on the idea that all humans are worthy of salvation, that all are redeemed and bound for heaven, that grace is for everyone. And so it's been good to learn that there are many ideas of a grace that allow for this kind of expansive love. There's a grace that focuses our attention on the ways that life is generous. There's grace that produces feelings not of supremacy at being part of an elect few, but rather feelings of gratitude for ways that life can surprise us and lead us through new doors. The concept of grace best serves human flourishing when we reject any us versus them thinking, and when we step away from Wizard of Oz notions of a God pulling levers and strings behind a secret curtain. In response to a grace that creates fear and division through hierarchies and favoritism, we can choose to embody and model a grace of acceptance and appreciation and abundance. We human beings are not mere puppets killing time before a predetermined afterlife. This world is not a waiting room or an audition. The here and now matters greatly for its own sake. We know that humans have a say in their own destiny. And some aspects of life, like science and medicine, are less mysterious than they've ever been. Life is still full of unexpected developments, welcome and unwelcome. And a healthy grace, a humble grace, a loving grace can put us in the spiritual mindset to receive what comes and to accept life's gifts with gratitude. I want to now share with you a story about grace and gratitude. It's a story about Minnesota and Wisconsin, the two states that I've lived my life in, two states that I move between with regularity, and two states that share a mighty and beautiful river. This particular story I want to share begins at 3:15 in the morning, a time of day when many of us might not have much gratitude and maybe even less grace. But even at that early hour, I was mostly just grateful to have had a comfortable bedroom to stay in. I was at a friend's house near where the Mississippi River widens out into the big curving expanse of Lake Pepin. The area is full of woods and parklands and vistas from high bluffs, and it's one of my favorite places anywhere. If I had to be awake in these wee hours, Lake Pepin was a pretty good place to be. I was on a work assignment in my old job as a newspaper reporter, and I needed to get myself to the riverfront in Winona, on the Minnesota side, by daybreak. I was out the door by 4 a.m., and as I turned south onto the Great River Road, my car seemed to be the only moving object around. But there were signs that the day was stirring. Once the streetlights of town were behind me, I noticed the faintest easing of darkness in the eastern sky. A few miles later, the palest pink light brushed the top of the bluffs on my side of the river. It was like the opposite of a curtain rising as the warm glow began to make its way down the tree-covered limestone. As dawn got closer, the river valley became a canyon of sunrise colors. Oranges and blues and pinks spun together, bouncing off the river and echoing from bluff to bluff. I knew that I could not even begin to create a sunrise or a 400-foot bluff, nor could I carve a river valley out of limestone using only water provided by the sky. That morning, I could claim no credit whatsoever for the beauty that had unfurled before me. It was the gift of that day, a gift of eternal creation, a moment of grace, and I was grateful. Gratitude often springs from those things that we cannot do or do not do for ourselves. It has roots in the grace that others give us and in the gifts of this world. I am not one to get out of bed solely for the purpose of viewing a sunrise, and yet some spectacular sunrises have been given to me in my life. That morning along the river, I was grateful for the assignment from my job, for the hospitality of my friend, and for the morning itself. This pre-dawn drive I'm taking you on took place on one of the longest days of the year, and so when I got to Winona, the sky had quite a bit of light to it. I was in Winona on this particular morning, a Monday morning, because something unexpected had happened, something that disconnected the two states on either side of the Great River. The bridge at Winona, the only bridge across the Mississippi for a 60-mile stretch, had suddenly been shut down. This was not long after Minnesota had had a shocking and tragic day when a busy freeway bridge in the middle of a city suffered a deadly collapse. So when inspectors found some concerns on the bridge at Winona, they abruptly shut it down. The closing of the bridge meant that the thousands of people who crossed it every day suddenly faced a disorienting change. They experienced a humbling sense of powerlessness over their daily lives and livelihoods. When the bridge that we thought we were going to take to the next part of our lives is no longer available, how do we keep going? Where do we turn? The answer to that question sometimes can be found in community. Our religious community, the community of our families, the communities in which we live. I was in Winona on that early morning to witness that community's efforts to keep itself connected. Winona had grown up as a riverboat town, and with the bridge closed, it turned toward its history for a solution. Using a couple of large tour boats brought in from other cities, Winona's leaders mapped out an elaborate system of ferries and shuttle buses to try to get workers from the Wisconsin side over to their jobs in Minnesota. The planners did their best and hoped for the best on very short notice. I waited with them on the levee on the Winona side. I was standing near a monument of a steamboat, and we watched to see whether the plan would work, whether people would be willing to give it a try. We looked out across the swiftly flowing waters toward the park on the other side, and as the sun finally rose, people showed up. A lot of people showed up. They rode in on school buses from towns up and down the Driftless area on the Wisconsin side of the river. Some wore business attire and some wore factory clothes. They came in such numbers that they soon filled the beach. The closing of that bridge had disrupted these people's lives, but anger was not an emotion that was in evidence. These factory workers and office workers knew that they could no more build their own highway bridge than I could build a sunrise. A crowded tour boat made the first crossing just before 6 a.m. Instead of a barrier, the river was now a means of reconnection. 1,000 commuters made the trip that day, and gratitude filled the air. So sometimes grace is highly individual, like a gift of a pink sunrise that you never thought you'd see. And sometimes grace is communal, like a boat ride you never thought you'd need. The theologian and Episcopal priest Matthew Fox is among those who view community as a source of grace. He says that in community we are meant to grace one another, to be sources of grace, healers by way of grace. And gratitude so naturally often follows. Grace and gratitude share the same Latin root, and they have traveled together for millennia. And now, on my final day as your assistant sabbatical minister, I'm going to use the final part of my final sermon to talk about a very specific kind of gratitude. My gratitude for the chance to serve you. These 5 months together have been such a gift. And my journey with this congregation is its own story of grace and gratitude. Some of you may have heard me tell this story in coffee hour, but way back when I first learned about First Church, it was by total chance. I was 21 years old and a summer intern on the copy desk at the old Milwaukee Journal newspaper. I'd been there only a few weeks when I happened to be randomly assigned a religion page article about an annual conference that was coming to town. A conference of some people I had never heard of before. They were called Unitarian Universalists. It was 1990 and General Assembly was being held in Milwaukee. If I hadn't been available at that particular moment to edit that particular article, many more years might have passed before I had discovered Unitarian Universalism. I was not in the habit of voluntarily reading the religion page. I was intrigued by what the reporter had written, so I contacted the church, and brochures came in the mail. This is how they did it back then, right? Before long, I became a member of this congregation, and I was going to brunch regularly with the young adult group over at the Knickerbocker. I was living the grace of discovery and living gratitude for what was discovered. Fast forward 30 years. I'm no longer a journalist, but I'm a mid-career minister, one who happens to be available for your senior minister's sabbatical. I submit my application and, spoiler alert, I get the job. From the start, I am blown away by the friendliness of the congregants, the skill and morale and good humor of the staff, the high level of organization, the commitment of lay leaders and volunteers, and the deep passion and spiritual groundedness of your ministers and really everyone here. My first Sunday here was the Sunday that masks were no longer required, and the joy that you all had in seeing each other's faces was a testament to how much you value each other, especially after enduring years of pandemic, trauma, and loss. In community, we are meant to grace one another, to be sources of grace, healers by way of grace. And my goodness, can I just say, if you have never joined a congregational staff in the middle of a church year, it is like parachuting onto a speeding train. It was thrilling, and there was so much to learn, and you all showed the new guys so much grace as I tried to figure it out. To figure out your systems and your traditions and your cast of characters, and like any good church, you have quite a few characters. I have so much gratitude for your grace and your embrace. Some of you have asked what I'll be up to next, so instead of answering that 100 times in coffee hour, I'm going to tell you now. First, as I mentioned in the newsletter, I'll be staying away from First Church for a period of time so that you all can refocus on your relationships with your permanent staff ministers and celebrate Reverend Jennifer's return next month. This break of 6 months to a year is a healthy and customary reset in congregations. During the rest of this year, I'll be doing some guest preaching. I'm also planning to work with the regional staff of the UUA this fall as they help congregations with the onboarding of new ministers, something I have recent experience in. For 2024, I've already got my eye on some sabbatical fill-in ministries in other cities, in no small part because this gig was so much fun. 2024 is also a time that I expect to be politically active, given that it is a critical election year. And starting in June of next year, I'll be enrolled in a Doctor of Ministry program at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary with a focus on creative writing and public theology. So my ministry will continue, and more importantly, so will yours. And so for now, I say farewell, filled with thankfulness for First Church and for the crucial role it plays in Milwaukee, and for the crucial roles it has played in my life. Thank you for welcoming me as one of your ministers. I leave with immeasurable gratitude and First Church will always have a place in my heart. Amen.
The practice of sharing is accomplished under this roof in different forms every week to make a difference. We share half of all the non-pledged cash in our offering plate with a community organization to participate and strengthen our promise towards the betterment of our community. Today, we share the plate with Wisconsin Unitarian Universalist State Action Network, abbreviated as WUUSAN. WUUSAN aims to build a statewide advocacy network employing the power of collective voices of Unitarian Universalists in Wisconsin, upholding the worth and dignity of every person while acting to further justice, equity, and compassion. May the practice of giving brings us joy. The offering will now be gratefully received. Thank you.
I've heard it said that people come into our lives for a reason, bringing something we must learn, and we are led to those who help us most to grow if we let them, and we help them in return. Well, I don't know if I believe that's true, but I know I'm who I am today because I knew you. Like a comet pulled from orbit as it passes the sun, like a stream that meets a boulder halfway through the wood. Who can say if I've been changed for the better? But because I knew you, I have been changed for good. It well may be that we will never meet again in this lifetime. So let me say before we part, so much of me is made of what I've learned from you. You'll be with me like a handprint on my heart. And now, whatever way our stories end, know you have rewritten mine by being my friend. Like a steamboat from its moorings by a wind of the sea, like a seed dropped by a skybird in a distant wood. Who can say if I've been changed for the better? Because I knew you. I have been to clear the air. I ask forgiveness for the things I've done you blame me for. But then I guess we know there's blame to share, and none of it seems to matter anymore.
Like a ship blown from its moorings, a wind off the sea.
Stream that meets
Like a sea drop, a bird in the wood. Who can say if I've been changed for the better? I do believe I have been changed for the better.
because I knew you.
Because I knew you. Because I knew you.
I have been
changed for good.
Our closing words this morning are from the Reverend Gary Kowalski. With faith to face our challenges, with love that casts out fear, with hope to trust tomorrow, we accept this day as the gift it is, a reason for rejoicing. And if you need another reason to rejoice, today's coffee hour will have cake, so come on by. Will you now please rise in body or spirit for our recessional hymn number 128 in the gray hymnal, For All That Is Our Life.